Hi, my name is Justine van Heerden, and I'm an archaeologist with the Hunter-Gatherer Archaeological Research Project, or HARP for short. We are a team of archaeologists that study hunter-gatherer sequences in the Middle Limpopo Valley to better understand how hunter-gatherers on this landscape lived and how they contributed to the emergence of the Kingdom of Mapungubwe, which is considered to be the first state in southern Africa. The Middle Limpopo Valley is an area that spans across the borders of South Africa, where I'm currently standing, as well as Botswana to my right and Zimbabwe to my left. One of the goals of HARP is to share our research with the general public. We have achieved this by creating an outreach initiative based on an interactive traveling museum. Our museum aims to make heritage from this era more accessible and to create an opportunity for people to have an interactive experience with cultural heritage. We also aim to share with people the research that we do based on hunter-gatherers, as well as archaeology as a whole. So without further delay, let's look at the HARP Traveling Museum. So here we have the Traveling Museum. As you can see, our museum consists of two parts. So firstly, the wooden frame, and then secondly, the 5 display drawers. Now each of our displays discusses a different topic and a different period of time in the Middle Limpopo Valley with a specific focus on hunter-gatherers during that period of time. But before we start looking at the displays, there are 2 concepts that we use in archaeology that I would like to share with you today. And the first one is that of stratigraphy. So if you take a look at the side of the museum, you will see that each side is color coded. Now this is not just for decoration, but it is to visually illustrate stratigraphy that we see when we excavate. So stratigraphy is the term that we use to refer to the different layers of soil that form in the ground. So let's say we have bedrock right here. Right? Over a long period of time, a layer of soil forms on top of that bedrock. More period of time goes by, and another layer forms, and another and another. So I would like you to imagine that if you dug a very big hole in the ground, big enough for you to stand in, and you stand inside and you look at the wall, you will then see these different layers of soil. They might be different in color, maybe different in texture or compaction, so how hard the soil is, or even there might even be a difference in how many archaeological artifacts you can see. Now these stratigraphic layers are what we see when we excavate, and we sometimes use them as units within to excavate. Okay, so don't get out of the hole yet. For our next concept, I would need you to stay inside. I need you to still imagine that hole and the different layers that you see. Okay. The next concept is the law of superposition. So for this law, it states that a layer of soil that formed below or very low in the ground is older than any of the layers that formed on top. So if you imagine those layers, or if you look at the displays of the museum that visually illustrates those stratigraphic layers, whatever is at the very bottom is older than any of the layers on top of it. The very top layer, so this one right here, would be the soil that we walk on today and would be younger than any of the layers underneath. Okay, let's use another example. So please get out of the hole, okay, and imagine a big laundry basket, a big upright laundry basket. Okay, if you threw laundry in your laundry basket from Monday up until Saturday, right, each day, Monday laundry, Tuesday laundry, Wednesday, that laundry that you threw in on Monday would be the oldest, and the laundry that you threw in last on Saturday would be the youngest. If we look at Wednesday's laundry, right, it would be younger than Tuesday and Monday's laundry, but older than that of Thursday, Friday, and Saturday. So that is exactly how it works with stratigraphic layers. We can also use the law of superposition to date artifacts. Okay? So let's imagine in your laundry from Monday you have a candy wrapper in your pocket. Okay? And on Saturday you have a chips packet in your pocket from your laundry from Saturday, right? If we then follow the law of superposition for stratigraphic layers, the candy wrapper in Monday's dirty clothes is older than the chips packet from Saturday's dirty clothes. And that is what we call relative dating. So what is the date, what is the age of this artifact relative to what is going on around it? Okay, so those are the two concepts that we oftentimes use when we excavate. But there's one more thing that I just want to say before we start looking at the displays, and that is that there's a questionnaire that is connected to the museum and to my master's research. It's a short questionnaire that basically just asks you, did you like the museum? Yes, no, why yes, why no, that sort of thing. It will really help my research a lot because it will form the basis of my data, and it will also help me to make any improvements to the museum to make it better for those who view it after you did. So the museum will be available in a link below the video, and it is completely anonymous, completely voluntary, and it will take about 15 to 20 minutes to complete. So without further ado, let's start looking at our different displays. So we are now following the law of superposition. So we are starting with our oldest layer of soil, or our oldest topic, and that would be the very lowest display. So we start with the oldest time period that we will be discussing today, and that is the early and the middle Stone Age.
So hunter-gatherers were present on the Mapungubwe landscape during these two periods of time, and they created a variety of stone tools. So in this display, we actually have two sides. So on this side, we have the early Stone Age, and on that side, we have the middle Stone Age. So let's first look at the early Stone Age. So these four over here. So the early Stone Age in the Middle Limpopo Valley dates from around 1.75 million to 300,000 years ago. So yeah, that's a very long time. Let's first take a look at these three stone tools over here. These are all hand axes from the Acheulean period. And from that period, we see hand axes that have this pear or oval shape to them. Yeah. And these were very versatile too. They were used in butchering activities, in hunting activities, even in food production. So they would use these to smash hard foods or to smash food until they are soft. This is our last one for the early Stone Age. This little guy is a chopper core from the older one period. He was used to break bone or to maybe even break some rocks. But bone they were specifically breaking to get to bone marrow. Okay, so that is our early Stone Age. Now we have the Middle Stone Age. So all of these. The Middle Stone Age in the Middle Limpopo Valley dates from between after 250,000 years ago to 40 or 20,000 years ago. And this period was characterized by these types of blades. Okay, so surprisingly, these blades were used for cutting activities. So they were using this to cut wood, to cut bone. They might even been shaping pieces of bone and wood into sharp points. The bone might have been for needles and the wood for digging sticks. Again, so a very versatile tool in this period of time. This little guy in the corner is an example of a flake. I'll discuss flakes a little bit more in our next display, but keep this one in mind. We have other examples of flakes as well in the Middle Stone Age. So these two are also flakes, but they are called convergent points. So they were flakes that were worked a little bit more. So here a flake was taken off and there another one to create this very sharp point that we see. And this was used in any type of stabbing activity, really. Our last one for the Middle Stone Age is this one. This is a heavy duty scraper. Now, I don't know if you can see, but it's basically curving. It's doing this. Yeah. And then this edge where that curve ends, they were using this edge in scraping animal hide to get off that fat and the meat from the hide so that they could then use that hide for clothing or whatever they needed. So before we move on to our next display, because this is all for this display, I would like you to keep 3 stone tools in mind. So this big blade in the middle, right? I'm going to use my hand as a scale, so remember that scale, okay? Then this flake in the corner, again, compared to my hand, and this heavy-duty scraper. You see, okay. So let's keep those in mind as we move on to our next display.
Okay, so that is it for the early and the middle Stone Age. Let's move on to our next display. So next up is the later Stone Age.
So this period in the Middle Limpopo Valley dates back to after 40 or 20,000 years ago, and here we have some examples of the stone tools that were being produced by hunter-gatherers during this time. Now, the very first thing that I want to say about these stone tools are the difference in size when you compare these to those stone tools that we saw in our previous display. They are much, much smaller. So think about it like the cell phone. The cell phone started out as this big, bulky brick, and as technology developed and we became better at making cell phones, they became thinner and thinner and smaller. And that is exactly what happened from the early Stone Age to the Middle Stone Age, and then lastly to the later Stone Age. So let's take a closer look at these 4 jars. They actually show the process of making stone tools. So they are showing the different stages of production when we are trying to make stone tools. So first off, we start with 2 rocks. Let's say these are our 2 rocks, right? So from this rock, we want to make our stone tool. Cool. Now we need a second rock, which we sometimes call the hammer, and we then hit our first rock so that a little piece of flake, or that's what we call them, flakes, the little pieces of rocks that come off, so that a little piece will come off. So these over here are examples of this first rock, which we call the core. So on this side, you can actually see that is what the rock looked like on the outside. But if we flip it over, we can see that little pieces of stone were taken off from that side, as well as that one and this one as well. All of those little pieces are flakes that were taken off. So we do have examples of flakes as well. So these are those. And compare the sizes of these, right, to the little flake in our previous display that was around about over here. That was the size maybe of my palm, let's say the palm, right? Compare that size. It's much, much smaller. So to identify a flake, it can be sometimes easy. Not all of them look like this. But if you find a stone like this and you flip it over and you look at the back side, right, you will see something like this, a little bulge right there, okay? That is called the bulb of percussion. So what happened with this little flake was, if we have its core, the inside of the core, right, this flake was situated like that, okay? Then someone took a hammer and hit it from the top, right over there. This little flake then popped off, and there we see the bulb of percussion. So if you see a stone lying around and it has this little bulb, it might be a stone tool. Okay, so let's move on, because they did not always leave flakes just like this. They would then work these flakes a bit more, take more pieces off to make what we call formal stone tools. So those are the stone tools that were then actually used for different activities. In this jar over here, we have different examples of stone scrapers, right? So again, let's think about our previous display. We had a heavy-duty scraper around here, right? And it was the size of my hand. Look at that comparison. So this one is a very nice example of a stone scraper, because on this side we have a very flat side, right? And then on the top, it does that exact same curving as our heavy-duty scraper did, right? And then you can see on that side, little bits of flakes were taken off to make that edge as sharp as they possibly could. Okay, so those are scrapers. Then in our next jar, we have more examples of formal stone tools. This one is an adze. Okay, so this was used for woodworking, like we had with the older one, chopper core, in our previous display. Next, I want to show you this one. Okay, this is the latest Stone Age version of a blade, right? You remember the blade from our previous display? It was this big one in the middle, almost the size of my hand. And that is the blade in the latest Stone Age. So you are probably wondering, how would they have used blades like these and even scrapers like these to cut or to remove fat from animal hide? So the answer is that stone tools in the later Stone Age were actually hafted onto wood or some maybe even bone. So they were basically creating a handle on which to place the stone tool so that they could actually use them. Sometimes we see blades like these, but smaller ones, so bladelets, little blades, being hafted onto, let's say this is now a piece of wood, being hafted onto a piece of wood, a bunch of them like that, and they thus creating a saw. Okay, so very creative. The last formal stone tools that I want to show you are these ones. Okay, so this one is a backed tool, right? And we also call these segments, because if you think about a tangerine or a nachi piece, right, it kind of looks like that type of a segment. So these were also hafted, right? So let's say that this is a piece of wood. They could have hafted them like that, or maybe even with the sharp point showing up, or maybe even that way, right? Or they could have taken both of these and overlapped them, something like that, halved them, okay, and created an arrowhead. Okay, so they were very creative. So, as you can see from these stone tools, and from the ones that we discussed in the previous display, many of them are used in hunting activities, right? And we see the evidence of hunting activities in archaeological sites in the form of animal teeth that we have here and animal bone. So these animal bones specifically, they were burnt. So you now know that hunter-gatherers from the later Stone Age really liked brine. So yes, it comes from a long time ago. So we do see evidence of hunting activities in the remains of animals if we find them at our sites. But hunter-gatherers during this time, they weren't only hunting, they were making rock art, which we will see in a little bit, and they were making jewelry and they were trading. So jewelry in the form of ostrich eggshell beads, which are these. So these are different examples of the types of ostrich eggshell beads that we find in our sites. Sometimes we do find them broken, and they can be very different in sizes. So we'll look at how ostrich eggshell beads are made, but only in one of our other displays. But these are very good examples. They were also making beads from other types of materials, so they sometimes also used land snail shell, as this one. I did not have an example of a land snail shell bead, but here you have the shell, so you sort of know what type of material these beads were being made from. They also sometimes used freshwater mussels to create these types of beads as well, and those are usually very small and very thin.
So that is all we have for the latest Stone Age. Let us move on to our next one. Next we have the rock art display.
So rock art in southern Africa was painted within the last 3,000 years, so during the later Stone Age. And in the Middle Limpopo Valley, we usually find two different types of rock art. So the first is finger-painted rock art, which was usually painted by Khoikhoi communities. And the second is fine-lined rock art, like the one that we see here. These were usually painted by the San, and they could have used something like this. Now, all of these tools were created by experimental archaeologist Dr. Nikki Sherwood. So we did not find any of these in an archaeological site. They were created, and this is just an estimation of the type of tools that they might have used to create fine-lined rock art like this. So here we have a recreation of a paintbrush, and Nikki added some mud and twine around the edge of this brush to make it easier to grip. These are two examples of ochre holders. So ochre is a type of sandstone and it is very pigmented. So we find bright colors like red, orange, yellow, and they would use this ochre to make paint, the rock art paint that we see. Now, these little tips over here is where the ochre would have then been stored. And here we have an example of a paint mixer, so where they would have mixed all of the ingredients they needed to make rock art paint. Now, painting or paint for rock art, it did not just grow in nature, they had to make it. So they would have used materials like ochre, maybe even egg yolk and egg white, blood, spit, water, anything like that, and they would have mixed all of that together, even tree sap, and then mixing all of that together to make rock art paint. So let's take a closer look at our panel over here. Now, this panel is from Edmundsburg in Venetia, so that's in the middle of Limpopo Valley. And before we continue, I just want to mention that if you see rock art, if you go out hiking or exploring and you find rock art, please do not touch it. This rock art is fine because this is just a recreation. I painted it with modern paint and a modern paintbrush, so it's okay to touch these ones. But if you find rock art, please do not touch them because of the organic materials that we use to make the paint. The oils in our fingers can sometimes damage those materials that were used. So this one is fine. Rock art in nature, not fine to touch. Okay, but as I said, this panel specifically, it's a recreation from a panel we find in Edmundsburg, and it depicts a herdsman that we can see over here. He's actually holding a long staff over here, and 4 fat-tailed sheep.
So what you need to know about fat-tailed sheep is that they are not indigenous to southern Africa. They were brought into this area by farming communities that arrived during the Iron Age. So here we have a rock art panel that was painted by the San community. So that would mean that hunter-gatherers, the San, were in contact with people from the Iron Age. Now, usually in archaeology, we associate hunter-gatherers with the later Stone Age or with the Stone Age, and farming communities with the Iron Age. But here we see these two periods of time overlapping. And that is the point that I usually like to make with this display, is that even though I have placed these different periods of time into literal boxes, that is not how we should think of these time periods. People during the later Stone Age and during the Iron Age were interconnected. They were sharing ideas. They were in contact with each other. The later Stone Age did not suddenly stop and then the Iron Age began.
We have quite a few different interpretations of how we can view this specific panel. So let's talk about some of them. So it is possible that this is a bushman herding 4 fat-tailed sheep for somebody else. It might be a bushman herding fat-tailed sheep for themselves. Or it is possible that this entire panel is a bushman painting of a Kwekwe herder herding fat-tailed sheep.
Now, the last interpretation of this panel of rock art is that fat-tailed sheep became important to the San spiritual world. And that is because when we see rock art, most of it was painted by Bushman shaman, and it depicts what they see when they enter into the spiritual world. Now, we know that the eland is a very important animal to the Bushman, and that is because of the fatty dewlap that it has underneath its chin. So this fat was very important because it was consumed by the shaman to therefore consume the potency or the power of the eland as they entered into the spiritual world. We then also have reports of shaman saying that their bodies morphed into that of an animal when they entered into the spiritual world. And we can see this in rock art when we see human figures with sometimes the feet or the hooves of an animal or the head of an animal or even the tail. So the argument is that the fat stored in the fat-tailed sheep's tail became important in the same way of the fat stored in the eland's dewlap. So, if you take a closer look at our herdsman,
you can then actually see that it appears that he has the same type of tail as the 4 fat-tailed sheep.
that is all we have for the rock art. Let's close this one up. Then, speaking of farming communities and the Iron Age, we move on to, you guessed it, the Iron Age.
With the Iron Age in the Middle Limpopo Valley, we see the arrival of farming communities. Now, we are not sure when exactly the first farming communities started to move throughout the area, but we think it was around AD 100. At about AD 900, we see larger farming communities settling down in the Middle Limpopo Valley, such as the Zizo communities. Now, as you guessed it, farming communities farmed. They planted things like sorghum and millet, and that was one of the big differences between them and the hunter-gatherers that were still present on this landscape during the Iron Age, because as you guessed it, hunter-gatherers hunted and gathered for their food. But with the arrival of farming communities, we also start to see pottery. So here we have a few nice examples of pottery, and if you look very close, you can see the types of decorations that they made on these pots. Now, pottery was usually used to store water or to store beer. It could have also been used for cooking purposes, and we sometimes see little implements like this little pebble that could have been used to create this very smooth edge of the pottery. This pebble over here might have been a nutting stone, so much like the hand axes from the early Stone Age, this one could have been used to soften hard foods. With the Iron Age, we also start to see a lot of trade taking place, and that was happening with the trade network that was coming down on the eastern coast of southern Africa. So with the trade, we start to see a lot of glass beads coming into the Middle Limpopo Valley. Now, these glass beads were usually quite small, but they were then taken and melted down into a clay mold to create very large glass beads. Now, this is the closest example that I could find to a type of bead we call a garden roller. So that was the very big bead that was made after the small beads were melted down, and that bead would have been about, well, that big, but it would have been could have been this type of color as well. And then obviously with the Iron Age, we start to see iron artifacts. So we also find iron jewelry. These are examples of iron helixes or metal helixes. So what happened was that the metal was taken, melted down, and then spun around like this until they created fragments such as these. Along with other iron implements that we find, we also find these types of iron artifacts. This is a metal arrowhead that might have been used for ceremonial purposes, but we also find iron in the shape of slag. So that is what is left behind after metal is melted down, and the best quality metal is taken to make metal artifacts. So this is the little bit of metal that is very low quality that is then left behind. When we find slag, for example, when we go excavating or surveying, we then know that some type of melting activity involving metals were taking place either in that exact spot or somewhere nearby. With the Iron Age, we also see that people were spinning cloth. So here we have a fragment of a spindle wheel that would have gone along that edge, so it would have looked like a donut, and it would have been used to spin cloth. What we also find in the Iron Age is something called grain bins. So if you are part of a farming community and you have a lot of sorghum and millet that you just cultivated, you would need some place to store your sorghum and millet. And that is when we start to see grain bins. And here we have 3 fragments of a grain bin.
So grain bins were constructed by first making a base out of big rocks, And this is just to elevate the grain bin so that whatever is stored inside does not become contaminated by moisture. So after the base was constructed, they then constructed a wooden frame out of poles or sticks, and clay was placed on top of this wooden framework, which is the two pieces over here that we see.
And with the examples that we have here, you can actually see the indentations that were left in the clay by that wooden frame. Our last piece of the grain bin that we have is this one over here. This is a piece of vitrified dugger. So dugger is what was also used as a base in a grain bin, and it was made from cattle dung, gravel, and grass that was all mixed together, and it created a very solid base. And what happened with this specific piece was that it got turned into glass, which was probably the result of some type of burning activity.
Now that is everything for our Iron Age display. Let's take a look at our last one. So very last, we have experimental archaeology.
So experimental archaeology is a field where archaeologists try to recreate artifacts in the same way that they would have been made in the past. So in this display, we have a lot of experimental archaeology artifacts that were made by Dr. Nikki Sherwood. Now let's look at an example to explain experimental archaeology a bit more. So let's say Nikki created a stone scraper like this one in the same way that we think stone scrapers were made in the past. Now let's say she took that a step further and she used this scraper to scrape different types of materials. So let's say, for example, a piece of wood, a piece of bone, and animal meat. Okay, so if she took a closer look at this edge of the stone scraper under a microscope, she would see that each of those different materials left a different pattern on the stone scraper. So just for example, let's say the piece of bone left a zigzag type of a pattern. Okay, so what we do then is, if we go and excavate an archaeological site and we find another stone scraper made by hunter-gatherers in the later Stone Age, and we then compare the edges of these two scrapers and we see, oh, we used this one in our experimental archaeologies to scrape bone, and it left a zigzag pattern. And we take a look at this stone scraper that was used by hunter-gatherers in the later Stone Age, and it also has a zigzag pattern, then we can think, oh, well, this one might have been used to scrape bone. And that is why experimental archaeology is very useful in our field. But now let's take a look at our display itself. We again have two sides. So on this side, we look at the different stages of production of some archaeological artifacts. And on this side, we talk about how these artifacts were being used. So let's start here. Here we have an example of what a bone point might have looked like. So in the later Stone Age, I mentioned that stone tools were used to create this very sharp point with bones. And here we have different examples of how that can look like. Our next artifact is ostrich eggshells. So there are two ways that I will be discussing of making ostrich eggshell. And the first is this one. So firstly, you take your ostrich eggshell and you break it down into smaller pieces like this one. You would then take a drill, so let's say for example a piece of rock, and you would drill a hole on the one side of your shell, flip it over, and drill a hole on the other side until the two holes connected. Okay, you would then make quite a few of these, and you would string them onto a piece of twine, right? And then use a rough rock and go like that to sand those edges down until it creates the small round ostrich eggshell beads that we see in the later Stone Age. Another way of creating ostrich eggshell beads is by first creating the round shape that you find, but it would be a lot smaller than this one, and would be as small as the ones we saw in the later Stone Age. And after you've created that circular shape, You would then drill the hole from the one side and from the other side. But with this technique, we see that a lot more shells are prone to breaking because your shell is then already very small when you try to drill a hole. In the corner here, we have the stages of production again of stone tools, but we already took quite a close look at how stone tools were made, so let's move on to our other side. Here we talk about how artifacts were being used. Okay, so if we have a stone tool and we would like to use it, such as formal stone tools, we would maybe place it onto a haft, and this is what that would have looked like. So with the haft, they would have created this slit right there, and they would have used tree sap and some twine wrapped around that edge and wrap it very, very tightly so that those two edges would be forced together to secure that stone tool. So those two edges would be doing that. And that is how a haft would have been made. This is a haft that was made from a modern piece of wood and sanded with a modern sander, which is not how they would have done it in the later Stone Age, but it is a good visual. So now let's say we have our stone scraper hafted very nicely, and we've been using it for quite a while, and it's become blunt. We would now need to resharpen it, and a way to do that is called bone pressure flaking. So let's take one of our stone scrapers here, let's say this one, and our edge over there has now become blunt. We need to resharpen that edge. So we take a piece of hide to protect our hands, right? And we use a piece of bone, to pressure flake those little edges right there. So let's do this. I'm not an experimental archaeologist, so I will just show you how the tools are held and how those flakes are then taken off. So that type of an action. So there we now have a resharpened stone scraper. As I mentioned in our later Stone Age display, we also see a lot of evidence of hunting activities, and then I also mentioned that hunter-gatherers were making arrowheads. Here we have a few examples of how those arrowheads could have looked like. So here we have a stone arrowhead and a few examples of glass ones. This one in the middle is actually obsidian, right? And it's an example of how an arrowhead might have been hafted. So again, we see that slit that was created, right? Same one that is there, and with that little bit of twine around, tied very tightly to force those two edges towards each other. We then also have quite a few other examples of arrowheads, such as these here. This one is an example of a European arrowhead. We don't find these in Southern Africa, but I thought that the shape of it was very cool, so I thought, why not show people a different style of arrowhead? But the ones that we find in the Middle Limpopo Valley or in Southern Africa usually have this little bit down here, which is called a tang. And that is then the little bit that would have been going into the slit of our haft, if you do that properly. And then you would have a hafted arrowhead. This one specifically, if you take a closer look at the bottom edge of that haft, you can see that a little hole was drilled right there. And that is because when Nikki made this arrowhead, hafted arrowhead, she actually used it as a keychain. So that is the part that was connected to her keychain. And she would then actually use the obsidian edge to cut clothing tags off of her clothes. So if you look very closely at the edge of that obsidian blade, you can then see some use wear on those edges. So the very last arrowheads that I want to mention are these in the middle. These were created from floor tiles.
So with these arrowheads, I like to explain an important concept in experimental archaeology. And that concept is that people from the past used the materials in their environments to make the artifacts that they needed. So the story with the floor tile arrowheads are that Nikki's parents were redoing their floors. And when Nikki saw these floor tiles, she thought, hey, can I make arrowheads out of these floor tiles? Is that possible? And that is exactly what people from the past also did. They took a look at their environment and they then used the available materials to make all the artifacts that they needed for hunting, for butchering purposes, or for food production, or any other type of activities that they were doing. And that is it for the experimental archaeology display and for the whole HARP Traveling Museum. Thank you so much for viewing this video. I hope you enjoyed our traveling museum and our presentation of the work that we do with HARP in the Middle Limpopo Valley, representing hunter-gatherers in the area. If you would like, please follow the link below the video to complete that questionnaire. Any responses would be greatly appreciated and help my research a lot, as well as help me to improve the museum later. Thank you so much for watching and have a nice day.